price of these sanctions is not just imposed upon Russia, it's imposed upon an awful lot of countries as well, including European countries and our country as well. And because both Russia and Ukraine have been the breadbasket of Europe in terms of wheat, for example. Just give one example.
Food shortages, Biden said, quote, they're going to be real. Once again, in case you missed it, to repeat, food shortages, not in Sudan, in Cincinnati, in Reno, in Spokane, in Norfolk, and of course in our big cities too, where not a single person who was born here has any idea what a food shortage is. Our problem has always been having too much food. Now we won't have enough. We know that because the President of the United States just told us that on camera. So what is this going to mean? How do food shortages affect a country? Well, if you're interested, go online and read about it. All of recorded history will answer your question. A food shortage is not like deciding to skip dessert. It's not a diet. It's not voluntary. A food shortage is different. It's scary. Food shortages topple governments. They turn moderates into revolutionaries. A food shortage is a big deal. You don't want one. But now we're getting one, just a little over a year into Joe Biden's presidency. Think forward. If the traditional calendar holds, we've got 1,032 days left of the Joe Biden administration. And you wonder what things will look like by then. We're already speeding toward dystopia. Not that the White House seems aware of it or to care in any way. Here's Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen from this morning, for example, letting you know it's time to stop whining about gas prices because actually, they're not very high.
How high do you think oil prices can get in the month?
Listen, there's a lot of uncertainty about it. They're not as high in real terms as they were earlier in this century, and it's conceivable that they could move higher.
Yeah, it's not a big deal. Settle down. And there's a reason for it. As Joe Biden explained, you're paying more for gas because we have slapped sanctions on Russia. And sanctioning Russia is the right thing to do. So shut up and feel virtuous as you slowly go broke. Now, for some people, particularly those who don't drive cars, this might seem like an adequate answer, but others in good faith may ask, okay, I'm not against sanctions in theory, but since they're clearly not hurting Putin, and they clearly are now hurting my family, what is the point of sanctions? Is there a point? Let me know, make me feel better. And the answer is, yes, America, there's a point to sanctions. Sanctions are designed to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine. We know that because not so long ago, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, told CNN that, quote, the purpose of the sanctions in the first instance is to try to deter Russia from going to war. And then Jen Psaki, the president's publicist, backed him up, quote, our intention is to have a deterrent effect with sanctions. Kamala Harris agreed. The difference, she said, the deterrent effect of these sanctions is still a meaningful one. So sanctions work, except they didn't actually work. Putin invaded Ukraine anyway. The sanctions failed. So what's the response? Admit they failed, try something new? No. Joe Biden is pretending that the administration never claimed sanctions would deter Russia from invading Ukraine. Here's the new line.
Let's get something straight. You remember, if you covered me from the very beginning, I did not say that, in fact, the sanctions would deter him. Sanctions never deter. You keep talking about that. Sanctions never deter. The maintenance of sanctions, the increasing the pain, and the demonstration why I asked for this NATO meeting today is to be sure that after a month we will sustain what we're doing, not just next month, the following month, but for the remainder of this entire year. That's what will stop it.
What does that even mean? Sanctions never deter. Why do you keep saying that? He said, well, because you kept saying it. Your White House press secretary, your vice president, your secretary of state, all said that verbatim. But they're not acknowledging that, hoping that our memories have been so damaged by the iPhone we'll be as forgetful as Joe Biden himself. Now they want us to believe that sanctioning Russia can force Putin into withdrawing from Ukraine. Is that true? Can Putin be sanctioned into retreat? Well, we certainly hope it's true, sincerely. But there's no evidence that it is true. There's not even really an expectation that it's true. Even Joe Biden didn't claim that was going to happen. So what is the point? We're not sure. That's a topic for another show. But in the meantime, this country, we know this for sure, is being badly hurt by those sanctions. As Reuters recently reported, quote, Western sanctions on Russia, a major exporter of potash, ammonia, urea, and other soil nutrients, have disrupted shipments of those key inputs around the globe. Fertilizer is key to keeping corn, soy, rice, and wheat yields high. Growers are scrambling to adjust. You following this? Those ingredients are necessary to put food on your table at a price you can afford. If you don't have those ingredients, what do you get? Food shortages, which are a direct result of policy from the White House, a policy whose intended effect is still not clear. What is the point of this? If there's a good point, people will put up with it. Why don't you tell us what that point is? Fertilizer bills are expected to jump around 15% just this year, and they could go higher. Some farmers say they are already seeing fertilizer prices go much higher than that. Why?
Mike Gunderson's family has been farming wheat, soybeans, and corn on this land since the 1950s. He expects the weather to throw him a curveball in farming, but not a war.
All the stuff in Ukraine, there's so much volatility in the market.
The U.S. imports $10.3 billion worth of fertilizer for crops. $1.3 billion of that comes from Russia, which is now off the market. The Minnesota Association of Wheat Growers says the farmers lay down fertilizer at least twice a year.
There's a lot of fertilizers that are 4 and 5x more expensive than they were a year ago. Fertilizer has drastically outpaced the rate of inflation.
Russia's ban on fertilizer is scheduled to last until the end of the year. And while supply is already tight this year, it's the future many are worried about.
So sanctions have thrown American agriculture into profound turmoil and will cause, again, as the president has told us out loud, food shortages, which are maybe the most destabilizing trend you could ever have in a country, not just to the politics, but to the social fact. It's scary. But it's not just sanctions. There are a lot of reasons. It's not just the war in Ukraine. In response to energy and food shortages, the Biden administration is shutting down domestic oil and gas production. That makes food more expensive. It makes everything else more expensive. And as the pressure on American farmers rises and as food becomes scarcer and more expensive in this country, that same administration is allowing the government of China to buy up this country's farmland. According to Politico, and this was 2 years ago, Chinese investors own nearly 200,000 acres of U.S. ag land valued at least $2 billion. Now, they're doing this in part with the help of subsidies paid for by U.S. taxpayers. And Chinese investors are continuing to buy more every single year. Again, food, water, energy. That's what you need for a country. The Chinese understand that. As Congressman Dan Newhouse put it, quote, the current trend in the United States is leading us toward the creation of a Chinese-owned agricultural land monopoly in our country, the most productive farmland in the world, now owned by what we used to call our main global rival, and I think we can now say with the realignment in progress is our main global enemy, owned by a country that seeks to displace us and punish us. It's insane. Would the Chinese government permit American investors to buy its country's farmland or water resources? That's not even a real question. Of course not. No sane country would do that. And no foreign entity should be allowed to control America's critical natural resources. So how long until the Chinese start scooping up the Great Lakes, which are our largest reservoirs of fresh water? Food, water, energy. Don't laugh. That's where we're headed. And it could happen much sooner than anyone seems to realize. Fishing companies are paying such high costs, they're running out of business. Here's another Fox Multimedia report.